market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Ukraine's president says he's willing to meet Donald Trump again if the U.S. president invites him to, quote, solve real problems. Volodymyr Zelenskiy met European leaders in London yesterday after clashing with the U.S. president and vice president in Washington on Friday. Now, French media reported that France and the U.K. are also working on a plan for a one-month truce. The U.K. Prime Minister said it's time for Europe to step up.
Not every nation will feel able to contribute, but that can't mean that we sit back. Instead, those willing will intensify planning now with real urgency. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air. Together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting.
Now, Finland, which shares a 800-kilometer-long border with Russia, told us Europe must counter Russia with strength.
The only thing that Vladimir Putin understands is power. You show any kind of a weakness, and he will basically go after you. There's a Russian saying that if you use a knife or a bayonet and push in and it's soft, go all the way. If it's hard, pull back. Let's be hard.
Well, joining us now is Fabrice Pothier, Chief Executive of Rasmussen Global and a former Director of Policy Planning at NATO. Here with us in the studio is also Stephanie Baker, a Bloomberg senior writer who spent a lot of time looking at the Russian economy and what Vladimir Putin's endgame is. So thank you both for joining us. Stephanie, it's been an extraordinary 4 days. I mean, I don't even know where to start. What did we witness in the Oval Office, and what will be the long-term repercussions of what Europe has to pay up?
Right. So I think the stark difference that was revealed by that Oval Office showdown was that Zelensky views a ceasefire without security guarantees as not sufficient to guarantee long-term peace. Whereas it looked like Trump was viewing his idea of a deal is just stop the fighting, try to do a quick deal, and it doesn't matter if there are U.S. security guarantees attached. And I think that is the fundamental problem here that both Europe and Zelensky needs to overcome. Trump administration officials are now demanding an apology from Zelensky. Zelensky obviously doesn't think he's done anything wrong. He was just trying to explain Ukraine's position. He's a war-weary leader with tremendous pride, and I think he was trying to explain that Putin can't be trusted. And he was trying to respond to Trump's rhetoric that does seem to be echoing Russian talking points. And so I think that's the fundamental problem here. And, Marco Rubio gave an interview yesterday trying to explain, look, we can't be attacking Putin and expecting him to come to the table. But I think there's the sort of two views on that. Is Trump really sympathetic with Putin, or is this a negotiating tactic?
And, Stephanie, we also heard from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and this is what he said on Vladimir Putin.
I think Vladimir Putin is an old-school communist, a former KGB agent. He's not to be trusted, and he is dangerous. The way I view this is that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are engaged in a new Axis powers, and they are not on America's side. Let's be crystal clear about that.
Fabrice, we saw also this extraordinary meeting in London yesterday with the coalition of the willing countries in Europe that want to step up defense. Is there a clear leader in this? One of the questions that keeps on coming up is actually, who do you speak to in Europe? Is there a lack of leadership, and what needs to be done now?
I think there's some clear leaders, with France and the UK being the foremost European military powers, also nuclear military powers. But that's obviously not enough. You need a European critical mass. You need a European coalition that is more than just two, that can really bring not just political depth, but also real military capabilities, because we are talking here about not necessarily a peacekeeping force, but like a reassurance deterrence force. And to deter Russia, you need some real signaling. You need to show you are committing real force, like the Finnish president was alluding. You need to show strengths. And therefore, the UK and France are not enough. I will add that I think at last, we are seeing this coming off the ground. And we have been at Rasmussen Global, for example, talking about the European coalition for the past 6 months. That's the way to negotiate with Trump also, to come to the White House with something to put on the table rather than just beg for a seat at the table. And I think finally the Europeans are getting their act together.
Stephanie, what are the risks in striking a deal with Russia without plausible and strong deterrence?
Well, I've long argued that Putin does want some kind of quick deal, like a ceasefire that would include some kind of sanctions relief, which he does want. And I think he wants some breathing room to regroup and rearm. I don't think his long-term goals for controlling Ukraine have changed fundamentally. And I think that's part of the problem with coming to a deal, is that he wants his negotiating demands are non-starters for Ukraine. He wants caps on Ukraine's military forces. Russia has annexed more territory than it actually controls on the ground. That's another sticking point. So I think without firm security guarantees from the U.S. backed up with some kind of peacekeeping force, I think it will be risky in terms of Russia coming back for another bite.
Yeah, and Fabrice, I guess the question is, can Europe, even if it gets its act together, go at it alone? Or do they need U.S. support? How long does Ukraine have if the U.S. suddenly actually doesn't give anything to Ukraine anymore?
I think here, to get it right, you have 3 critical layers. The first one being the Ukrainian forces. We tend to forget, but this is a formidable military right now, one of the best equipped in Europe, one of the most war-ready, because they are fighting every day. And they are close to beyond 500,000 of servicemen and women deployed right now on the Ukrainian soil. So this is the first line of defense, not to be underestimated. Second, you do need European forces, possibly where we are strong in the air and maritime domain. You could see a kind of no-fly zone, anti-access effort to be able to guarantee that the non-occupied Ukraine will be able to return to business, to normal reconstruction and economic development. And finally, to make all of this potent enough vis-a-vis Putin, you do need some U.S. guarantees to the European guarantors. You do need some U.S. Political declaration, but also signaling that if something were to happen, a dramatic escalation by Russia, that it will not be just the Ukrainians and the Europeans, that the U.S. will be there to watch our back. And I think that's what Starmer and Macron have been trying to negotiate with Trump over the past few weeks.
Stephanie, do you see a real risk of the U.S. and, Russia dividing Europe into spheres of influence?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's what Putin's ultimate goal is. He wants his own sphere of influence, and he's achieved one of his overarching goals, which is to divide Europe from the U.S. and weaken NATO. And I think NATO is weakened by this. By Trump's position and his stance, the meeting in the Oval Office, I think it raises real questions about whether or not the U.S. would come to Europe's aid if it was attacked. It's not just about security assurances for Ukraine. I know Trump did say he believed in Article 5, but you had Elon Musk today or last night saying that the U.S. should pull out from NATO and the UN. And I don't take that. I think that does have influence, and it could influence Trump's thinking. I mean, the ultimate risk here is that a quick deal on Putin's terms ends up rewarding Putin instead of punishing Putin, which is, the theme of my book on the economic war against Russia, that if the Trump administration agrees to give him what he wants, stop the fighting, give him some limited sanctions relief as an inducement without any long-term security guarantees or, plan to stabilize Ukraine, then that will weaken Europe long-term.
And Fabrice, with your many, many years at NATO, are you confident that NATO's deterrence will remain intact?
Well, I think nothing has fundamentally changed, and this current U.S. administration has clearly said they were not intending on changing U.S. presence in Europe. We have to see what happens in the coming years, but I think we are fine. The question, however, is where are we going next? And I think European stability and defense is now increasingly going to happen outside NATO, outside the EU is going to be coalition, and maybe down the line there will be then a reconnection with NATO. But right now, NATO is no longer the first in line. This is really going to be about the Europeans doing the heavy lifting in a new kind of geometry, and this is a new world, and we have to be creative in that sense also.
Okay, Fabrice, thank you so much. Fabrice Pothier, there, Chief Executive of Rasmussen Global, and Stephanie Baker, Bloomberg senior writer and author of Punishing Putin. Now, coming up, the U.S. charges towards imposing tariffs on Canada and Mexico tomorrow, barring last-minute negotiations. We'll discuss all of that with the markets, of course, Seema Shah of Principal Asset Management. This is Bloomberg. Now, the U.S. is set to impose tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada tomorrow, barring any last-minute negotiations. Now, traders are also watching for China's response as the National People's Congress begins this week. Now, our next guest says the latest U.S. tariffs could have a greater economic impact than levies Donald Trump imposed back in 2018. Well, Seema Shah, Chief Global Strategist at Principal Asset Management, joins us now. Seema, thank you so much for being here. I mean, the amount of goods that actually could be tariffed tomorrow is like 1.5 trillion. I mean, this is huge. What are the chances that this plunges the U.S. into recession?
So, hi, Francine. This is very, very significant. But again, we have to remember, we don't actually know exactly what's going to come in. So we could wake up tomorrow.
Fast.
Exactly. I mean, from a day-to-day perspective, we don't even know, let's say it is even introduced tomorrow, we don't even know how long it's going to be kept there for. Yeah. So there is a ton of uncertainty going on. In the worst-case scenario, from what we've been looking at, with a 25% tariff on Mexico, Canada, an additional 10% on China, it would have an impact on U.S. growth, pushing it down by around just over 1.1%. That's not enough to plunge it into recession. But, of course, the economic data in the last couple of weeks has been concerning. And one of the things that we are watching very closely is, of course, the deterrent business sentiment, consumer sentiment, and what are the capex plans. So there are so many different dimensions to Trump 2.0 that it's becoming more and more difficult to analyse what the potential economic impact could be.
Seema, where do you think it impacts first? Again, the market has definitely, over the last 3 to 4 weeks, I would say, changed from worrying about inflation to actually hurting at consumer spending. And again, this capex could have longer-term impacts if chief executives just hold off spending.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the things is for tomorrow. Let's say that it's delayed for another month. Of course, that's better than the worst-case scenario of the full tariffs being introduced. But it still means that there is that lack of uncertainty weighing on capex. So this is a fairly difficult period. I think, as you said, the sentiment has shifted. The focus has gone from potentially rate hikes to now more and more people saying, well, look, is recession on the horizon? We're not there yet. Yeah. We still think that actually the fundamentals of the U.S. economy is still very strong. Consumer balance sheets, corporate balance sheets, strong enough to withstand the various headwinds. But of course, there is the potential that this, continues to gain a lot of steam. And of course, we don't know what else is coming. And I think that's the key thing.
China's economy, how do you play it right now? Again, given the tariffs, given that it's also a big week for some of the politics and party politics that we'll hear about.
Right, so we have become somewhat more, optimistic on China. It's obviously been helped by valuations being so cheap that we didn't need too much good news in order to see that bump up in Chinese markets. What we're anticipating is, let's say the tariffs do come in tomorrow. We're not anticipating a very significant impact on China's GDP growth. You combine that with, as you said, there could be some further fiscal stimulus. We're going to hear what the GDP target is going to be. We're not anticipating too much, though, from policymakers there. We're not expecting a bazooka style of stimulus because also that they have been, I think, probably delighted by the fact that actually the worst case scenario of 60% tariffs haven't been introduced. So that, unfortunately, is a bit of a downside risk. But overall, from a fundamental perspective, China's economy does look somewhat robust. We're just not expecting significant upside from here.
So how do you build a portfolio in all of this? If you look at U.S. equities, do they still have a while to run, especially the big ones?
So we have maintained an overweight to U.S. equities. We've pulled back a little bit on those big Mag 7 at the beginning of this year because of valuations concerns that you could see some disappointment starting to creep in, but still some exposure there. Now, from here, I think what we've learned in the last 2 months is that global diversification has to be key. You know, there was concerns coming into the year that European growth would be very weak, China would continue to disappoint, and yet those two markets have done extremely well. And part of that has been that there has been surprises. Some of the policy expectations haven't come through from a US side, and there's been upside for global equities. I think that has to continue, that diversification, keeping that focus on some of the markets that have not, I guess, had the kind of the love to them over the last 2 years, and so are somewhat undervalued relative to the US. I think that US equities can continue to deliver positive gains, but are we going to see gains of the sort that we've seen in the last 2 years? It's very unlikely. And it becomes really important to start going down deeper. You know, what are the sectors, what are the kind of companies you want exposure to?
And where do you want exposure to? Especially, I mean, question marks over dollar, but it looks like at the moment it could keep on going stronger.
We are expecting the US dollar to stay somewhat strong. In terms of further dollar strength, again, it so much depends on, you know, are the tariffs going to come through or not. We have been impressed that the EM complex has been quite resilient. So, again, we're not too concerned about the EM complex still maintaining some exposure there. But within the US, the sectors, we're still looking at defences. We do think that the US economy is slowing. Recession is not on the cards, but we were expecting a slowdown to around trend growth anyway. And we're looking at some of the sectors which are a little bit resilient against tariffs. So which ones are less exposed? So things like financials come to mind, utilities, healthcare. So, again, maybe looking a little bit deeper onto the balance sheets, which are the ones which have the pricing power, the margin power that maybe others don't, because that is becoming increasingly important as consumers get a little bit worried about what's coming down the line, and businesses start to worry, you know, how are they going to be able to pass through any price increases?
Seema, on international equities, what do you look at?
In terms of region, we have got exposure across the broad complex. You know, Japan hasn't done so well at the beginning of this year, but we do maintain that from a fundamental perspective, the corporate reforms that are going on, the balance sheet, some of the companies continue to stand in good stead. So we are expecting Japanese equities to continue to deliver, through 2025. Some parts of emerging markets, parts of Latin America, of course, Brazil, less so in Mexico, but Brazil, Argentina, Chile still looking fairly strong. And then within Europe, actually the UK, I think, has the potential to get some upside. Valuations have been cheap. They haven't really joined in with a lot of the rally, but they are less exposed, I think, to some of the deepest concerns we have around Europe.
Seema, as always, thank you so much for joining us. Seema Shah, there, Chief Global Strategist at Principal Asset Management. Now, much more to come. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. A lot of news out today. Now, the Kremlin actually putting out a statement through Interfax calling the Trump-Zelenskiy argument unprecedented. The Kremlin also says that the argument shows how hard a settlement in Ukraine is. Now, we have had a lot of commentary, a lot of actually columnists trying to figure out whether there was a little bit more in it than what we saw on TV. Of course, the big question is, will Donald Trump invite Volodymyr Zelenskiy back in the U.S. to try and get a minerals deal and therefore extra support? So it's very clear that after the pretty heated weekend that we saw, with also the leaders showing up in London yesterday, it's defense stocks that are getting the most. BAE, Dassault Systèmes, Thales all getting between 15 and 11%. Apologies, Dassault Aviation, not System. Coming up, our conversation with the former Italian Prime Minister Mario Monti on the transatlantic relationship and what it means for European trade and security. This is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Volodymyr Zelenskiy says he's willing to meet Donald Trump again if invited back to the U.S. after the White House clash, while key European leaders rally behind Ukraine. European defense stocks jump as the region's leaders scramble to offer Ukraine support amid concerns of a U.S. pullback. Plus, markets brace for a barrage of tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China set to take effect tomorrow. Now, the UK and France are seeking to build a coalition of peacekeeping forces and help reassure Kyiv about any potential peace deal with Russia. Now, Bloomberg understands that the two countries aim to take the plan to President Trump in the coming days after his heated exchange with Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Oval Office on Friday. Now, it follows a security summit in London on Sunday with European leaders, including the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She's been called a Trump whisperer and has a long-standing rapport with Elon Musk, but also has to juggle domestic pressure, including a coalition partner who wants her job. Now, let's discuss all of these subtleties with the former Italian Prime Minister, Mario Monti, who also served as EU Commissioner. Mr. Monti, thank you so much, as always, for joining us on TV. When you look at the extraordinary pieces of news that we saw over the last couple of days from the U.S., is Europe alone? What's the way back from that?
It's a very difficult path because it's Europe that can and has to play a role in mending between Trump and Zelensky. But Europe has a much more demanding task, because if we look at it, the US has an approach now of withdrawing from international commitments in a broader sense. It will no longer be, I'm afraid, the champion of modern democratic capitalism as we know it, which is based, among other things, between a division between the economic power and the political power. That principle has been totally contradicted now in the UK, in the US. So in many respects, Europe has to make up for this diplomatic emergency, has to get seriously to a program for its own defense, and has to also get greater unity, because in many aspects in which there will be a vacuum from the US, Europe is the only part of the world which can come up.
But, Mr. Monti, what's your understanding of what the US is trying to do right now? Are they trying to retrench, or are they actually aligning themselves with superpowers that are not democratic, such as Russia? Is there a question mark of what their intent is?
I saw the two things in parallel and linked to each other, because they tend to link with autocratic powers, which means that but this has domestic and international implications. For example, in the vision about the economy. In the U.S., something is coming up, is taking shape of an oligarchy of top capitalists close or in political power, the scheme that has brought Putin to the situation where it is. So, because I'm so deeply in love with the U.S., I hope there would be a reconsideration, but the risk for the U.S. to lose leadership in so many aspects is there, and linking with autocracies is something which we will make of that process of withdrawal from leadership something like an aggressive isolationism on the part of the U.S.
Is Europe strong enough to take the lead? I know, and I hear this from many corners, now is the right time for Europe to step up. They're stepping up. I don't see a very strong leader that also has the backing at home who can truly step up.
Well, let's hope that the new German Chancellor has those basic qualities and favorable circumstances, but Europe has always made itself gradually through crisis, and we never had, in a sense, a crisis like this. And I see a lot of fast going in Europe to the idea now that I mean, it's not only the EU. Let me underline that what happened here in London in the last few days is of huge importance, And this rapprochement between the UK and the European Union in matters defense, intelligence, etc., is crucial. So and let's be frank, we also have to reconfigure who is in the European Union. Probably we have to go on with the European Union, but to build a closer agreement which does not include those countries which are in the European Union but are all with Putin, like Hungary.
Do you think NATO still remains a proper deterrent?
Yes. I think it has been hugely imprudent on the part of us Europeans to believe that NATO and the Americans could cover our defense needs indefinitely at a low price. They were becoming, that was visible a few years ago already, the US was becoming an unstable, volatile country as far as its foreign policy is concerned. So even if the American presidents had not asked for a higher contribution to NATO, we ourselves, Europeans, we should have tried to reach a greater independence from the volatile US.
I mean, this all comes at a time of great economic uncertainty because of the trade tariffs coming from the U.S. that are due to come into effect this week with levies on Mexico, Canada, China, and possibly the European Union. I mean, they touch $1.5 trillion of goods. How do you see the parallels between political and the economies that are, again, it's tough to actually borrow more and spend more?
The threat of tariffs, the pre-announcement of tariffs, and then when it comes, the introduction of tariffs, may be a powerful commercial instrument in the short term, but nothing like that will alienate much of the rest of the world, beginning from the very nearby Canada and Mexico to the US. And what happened to some extent during the previous Trump administration might happen in a more gigantic way now. That is that involuntarily President Trump elevates the global status of President Xi Jinping to the champion of multilateralism, of free trade, etc., which is partly an irony. But so the US, in my very modest view, is not calculating the, President Trump is a populist. We in Italy have known through Mr. Berlusconi the father of all the populists of the Northern Hemisphere, because Peron had come earlier. But the populists normally are excellent. They are the best in town in calculating the first impact of their pronouncements and of their decisions. But they are very poor in figuring out the second and third round effects. And I believe in the case of the US now, this is being underestimated by them.
But so if it's actually China at the end and Xi Jinping that becomes a true winner, how does Europe position itself to try and either get closer or counterbalance the power of China?
Well, certainly it is my conviction, at least, that the EU, if the US goes down the road that it has now started, the EU should feel less bound by loyalty to the US vis-à-vis China, and therefore should have a fairly autonomous policy vis-à-vis China, which one day, when, and I'm sure it will come, the US goes back to a more normal state of mind and policy determination, might actually be useful also for the US if Europe has exercised some, to the limit of its limited powers, but some influence on China.
Mario Monti, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. That was, of course, the former Italian Prime Minister, Mario Monti. Coming up, Finland's president urges Europe to stand up to Russia's Putin with strength in negotiations over a Ukraine peace plan. More from our interview with Alexander Stubb. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
stood with Ukraine from the first day. We will stand with them also when a potential peace deal comes, no doubt about it, and we will probably step up our aid. But I will not make any speculation about troops now, because there's so much that needs to be, clarified. What does that mean? Is it a peace monitoring troop? Is it a peacekeeping troop? Is it going to be at the front line? Is it going to be somewhere else? What will be the security guarantees?
Norway's Prime Minister there speaking before Trump and Zelensky heated a conference on Friday on what a potential peace deal for Ukraine might look like. Now, European leaders are racing to craft a peace plan for Ukraine after meeting at a security summit here in London. I spoke to Finland's President Alexander Stubb, who was there, and started by asking him about the disastrous meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky.
Well, sometimes public diplomacy doesn't work, but in these kind of situations, I think you have to be Finnish. Take a deep breath, take a cold bath, sauna, breathe, get back to the negotiating table. These things happen sometimes.
What's the way forward?
The way forward is to get President Zelensky and President Trump to communicate again and to get a minerals deal. I think that'll probably be a tipping point for a bigger deal towards a ceasefire and then towards peace negotiations. I don't think we are as far away as probably the public indicates.
We heard from the NATO Secretary General that it is up to President Zelensky to repair his relationship with President Trump. Do you agree?
I think it always takes two to tango. Sometimes what happens in marriage or in other types of relationships, you sort of go into your corner and sulk, but you have to come out of there, have a conversation, shake hands, and move on.
And do you think we're close to that point?
Yes, I hope we're moving. I mean, I think one of the things that we're trying to do in London with this summit organized by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is to get a reading of the 3 meetings that were held with President Trump last week, take the best parts of it and find a way forward.
What does Europe need to do now, though?
We need to have a plan. One of the problems is that we have sort of this cacophonic diplomacy. We have different types of groupings and organizations dealing with different types of things. If we want to have an initiative, there needs to be a European and Ukrainian peace plan with which we can then talk with President Trump and later on with President Putin.
What is your message today?
My message today is that we need a plan which should have 3 phases. First, what do we do before the negotiations start? In other words, put Ukraine into a position of strength, give them military, political and financial support, and put more pressure on Russia, sanctions, and use the frozen assets. And then find some kind of security arrangements where Ukraine takes the lead, Europe supports, and the US provides the backstop. That's stage number 1. Give that as a plan. Stage number 2 is a ceasefire, and stage number 3 is actual peace negotiations. We just need to put things together, and I think we are in the right direction to do that.
President, who speaks for Europe?
Good question. I think the late Henry Kissinger once said European foreign policy is all a good thing, but who should I call? Right now there are too many phone numbers. If it was up to me, I think we actually need a European special envoy. It can be 1, 2, or 3 people. I don't care. We probably need to have the big states here, so I think it's good that France and the UK are taking leadership here. I'm also hopefully glad to see Germany with skin in the game at some stage. So many different possibilities. But the problem that we have in the European Union right now is that we have 2 countries in the form of Slovakia and Hungary, which basically have a different view on Ukraine. The rest of us are friends of Ukraine. So the leadership of Europe right now is a coalition of the willing, and most of the countries are here in London today.
How optimistic are you about Europe's ability to stay together?
I'm very optimistic. I actually, I'm an EU nerd. I've been that for 30 years, and I've never seen the European Union more united. Actually, for the past 10 years, it started with Brexit, went on with Trump's first term, then COVID, war in Ukraine, energy, and now finding a peace solution. It's a little bit cacophonic, but it is united.
Do you worry that Russia is trying to influence different spheres, and with what's happening in the US administration, it makes it more difficult for Europe to go forward?
we need the United States, and that's why I think that the minerals deal is so important, because that could be the tipping point, which then gives a very strong business stake for the President of the United States, who works, for better or for worse, on a very transactional basis. So this is the reason I'm hopeful that we'll find a solution, and I think London is important from that perspective as well.
Why is it important to have Europe at the table when any peace agreement or any other agreement is negotiated between the US and Russia?
Because this is not only about the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. This is also about European security. It's about the free world, and it is about the international rules-based order. That's why Europe should be involved.
Alexander Stubb there, the president of Finland. Coming up, President Xi Jinping heads into China's biggest political meeting of the year as U.S. tariffs loom large. More on that next. And this is Bloomberg. President Xi Jinping heads into China's biggest political huddle of the year with his economy finally getting back some swagger. Now, Donald Trump's rising tariffs will test Beijing's ability to sustain that momentum. Now, let's get more with Brendan Murray, who leads Bloomberg's global trade coverage. A very busy man. Brendan, thank you for joining us. When you look at the timing of it, it's a pretty big gamble for Donald Trump to go after Mexico, Canada, and China in the same week.
Yeah, well, there may be some method to the perceived madness of this. If you, what we heard over the weekend from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, was perhaps Canada and Mexico and the U.S. could form what he called a fortress North America against China. So one of the leverage points that Trump has with Mexico and Canada is say, hey, join the U.S. join the U.S. in putting tariffs on Chinese imports, and maybe the three of us could work together. So we'll have to see what comes out of those the last 12, 24 hours worth of talks today. But it sounds like there could be some sort of North American, as Bessent called it, fortress allied against the wave of Chinese imports that all three countries are anticipating.
And Brendan, how do you see, again, going forward, when you look at, the state of the U.S. economy, there's a lot more worry, put inflation to one side, that chief executives are not spending money, that the consumer is not spending. So why add extra tariffs now?
Yeah, there is that risk. You wouldn't have said that 2 or 3 weeks ago, that some of the economic indicators are softening up for sure. And you have CEOs from companies like the automakers who are going to be very upset. Those companies are going to be very devastated by 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. So Trump is giving his address before Congress Tuesday night. He's going to want to go into that with a fair amount of optimism. And if markets are kind of crumbling around him, that's going to create an atmosphere that he doesn't want. So we'll have to see what happens today, but it would seem that something less than a full-scale trade war sparked overnight would be, what we could expect. I think markets are anticipating something like that too.
Brendan, thank you so much for joining us. Brendan Murray there, one of the busiest men, together with our head of government here at Bloomberg. Now, Bloomberg understands that Prada is moving closer to a deal to buy Versace from Capri Holdings for nearly 1.5 billion euros. So this is a big corporate story. Let's discuss all of this with our managing editor for Southern Europe, Tommaso Ebhardt, author of Prada, a family story. Tommaso also helped, of course, break this news over the last couple of days. So, Tommaso, this is, one of probably the biggest deals in fashion at the moment. Walk us through what we know.
Yeah, I mean, it's if it happens as we reported over the weekend, it's going to be a big change in the Italian luxury industry. You put together two of the most iconic brands in the industry, and you reverse a trend after decades where Italian brands were bought by foreign buyers. Finally, you have somehow an Italian group which is going to be able to defend itself versus the biggest peer in the industry, obviously LVMH or Kering. We know that essentially the two parts have found a sort of an agreement on the valuation of Versace, which could pave the way for a deal be announced later this month. And the valuation puts the value of Versace a little bit less than 1.5 billion euros. As a reminder, Capri bought it in 2018 for 1.8 billion euros. So talks are progressing.
What can we expect, Tommy, from Prada's full year results tomorrow? It feels like if there is one brand that's getting it right, it's probably Prada at the moment.
Absolutely, and even more, it's Miu Miu's sister brand. We are expecting to see another super strong quarter by Miu Miu, who somehow defied the downturn in the fashion industry by doubling its sales in the third quarter. And obviously, the strength of the brand could help in an acquisition of Versace when it comes, and it will show that Prada has somehow, a stronger firepower to digest an acquisition, which is quite interesting because it would put together two brands which are very different, the minimalist Prada and the maximalist Versace. Some analysts are saying that this is good because the two brands can be really complementing themselves.
Thank you so much, Tommy, for, of course, the terrific scoops. And I would urge everyone to also read his book for Italian speakers, but it will come out in English. Our managing editor there for Southern Europe, Tommaso Ebhardt. Now, the other big corporate stories is, of course, defense stocks flying off because of this renewed security concern with Ukraine and the fact that European defense has to step up, moving away from the U.S. sphere of geopolitics. BAE Systems getting 14%, Dassault Aviation also getting some 14.6%. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, Danny Berger, Manus Cranny in New York, and this is Bloomberg.